All right, for our descent checklist, um, we'll check our radar altimeter, set left and right checked. So for example, 2988, 200 set left, right, cross checked. Visual conditions response example would be same thing, 2988, left, right, and cross checked. So we're both checking altimeters and cross-checking altimeters against each other for any substantial discrepancy. Pressurization set by the pilot monitoring. Cabin altitude control shall be properly set for a landing. The mode selector should be auto. Crew brief should be briefed, so approach briefing shall be completed as early in the descent as practical. For the check the weather conditions, the stars, the review the approach plates, the radio management, runway environmental factors, terrain within 10 to 25 miles of the arrival airport. And the landing data, just review. So pilot monitoring will read out loud the landing data information as depicted on the appropriate landing data card. The pilot flying will respond with VREF, airspeed on speed cards, bugged left and right. So approach checklist. So the pilot flying will call for the approach checklist. Upon beginning the approach checklist, the pilot monitoring will respond approach checklist. Cabin notified, signs on. So will be signs on. Notify the cabin. The crew will check the altimeters. Wrong one. Altimeters, left and right. ECU for pilot monitoring will be on top. Fuel transfer, make sure is off. Aux pumps now are on, kind of like our GUMPS check, so to speak. And standby pumps are on. Pilot monitoring will notify the flight attendant to prepare the cabin. We'll cycle the fasten seatbelt advisory light. And like I said, ECU, so it's just ECU and across. For precision approach, intercepting the localizer, the pilot monitoring will state localizer alive. So looking at the HSI area. Pilot flying will say checked, set missed approach and altitude and heading. So we'll bug that in the altitude and heading needed on the instruments. Intercepting the glide slope, the pilot monitoring will say glide slope alive. Pilot flying will say checked. 1.5 dots below the glide slope, the pilot flying at 150 knots will call gear down. The pilot monitoring will silently verify appropriate gear extension speed and select gear down. 0.5 dot below glide slope, at 140 knots, the pilot flying will say flaps 15. So we'll go straight to flaps 15. Final checklist. And so the pilot monitoring will verify the flap speed and select the flaps to 15. So the approach speed will be between 110 and 120 knots and will be reduced after crossing the final approach fix. So a hand must be placed on the control yoke prior to crossing the final approach fix during the autopilot operation, and a hand must be left on the power levers anytime the torque is reduced below 40%. Either hand may be removed temporarily to perform other required duties. And then the pilot monitoring will do the final checklist, and we'll go over that. Pilot monitoring, 0.5 dot below the glide slope at 1,000 feet will say 1,000 feet above the airport. Pilot flying will say checked. Props max bleeds by 400. So props max bleeds off, and the bleed to min. So just think of pumps off, bleeds off sort of thing. Now, bleeds are off for coming into land. So pumps are on for coming to land, bleeds are off for takeoff and landing. 100 feet to go, approaching minimums, 100 feet to go is what the pilot monitoring will say. And then when the field is in sight, we'll state in sight. and the pilot flying will say in sight landing, or would say lights in sight, which will allow us to continue to 100 feet above touchdown zone. And then once we see the requirements, we can continue in. If it's a missed approach, the pilot monitoring will state missed approach if once we've hit our decision altitude, we don't see the runway or requirements. The pilot flying will call for METO power, so set METO power. So the pilot flying will advance the power levers. The pilot monitoring will then set the METO power to 97.5 on the torque. And once we see a positive rate of climb, the pilot monitoring will say positive rate. The pilot flying will call gear up, climb at GAV2. So we'll do that. The pilot flying will advance the levers, pressing the GA button. So make sure we push the GA button when they call for METO power. Climb at GAV2 when the lights are out, transit lights are out. Pilot flying will say push heading Alt Select. So there you go. Or push nav Alt Select, depending on what we do. It'll be LNAV Alt Select. So the pilot monitoring must verify the FMS has sequenced to the missed approach prior to pushing the nav mode button. So we have to verify down here that happened. Above 400 feet, the pilot flying will say flaps up, bleeds on. So as we climb above 400, so flaps up, bleeds on, and set to max position, and we'll verify if the flaps are out. Climb at 130 knots, and the pilot flying will say push indicated airspeed. Pilot monitoring will indicate push indicated airspeed. Indicated airspeed is whatever it may be, 130. Above 1,000 feet, climb power, climb checklist. So the pilot monitoring will set 90 on the torque and 1050 on the RPM. And complete the climb checklist. All right, if we're doing a RNAV approach, the main difference is that the pilot monitoring will now, upon passing the final approach capture fix, the pilot monitoring and says approach active. The pilot flying will say checked. VNAV arm. The PF, the pilot flying, will press VNAV on the glare shield to activate glide path capture. Do not arm VNAV until the indication of at or below the vertical path. The pilot monitoring will say checked. The pilot flying will say set missed approach altitude and heading. Pilot monitoring will set the missed approach altitude, and each pilot sets heading bug to the missed approach heading or runway heading if turn is not anticipated prior to the raising the landing gear. 1.5 miles from the final approach fix at 150 knots, pilot flying will call for gear down. So gear down. You'll silently do all that and verify the speed and all that. Half a mile from the final approach fix, we'll call for flaps 15 final checklist, and then the pilot monitoring verifies the flap setting to 15. No later than the final approach fix itself, the pilot monitoring will pronounce final approach fix LPV or final approach fix LNAV. And the same thing with the approach speed 110 to 120, hands where it needs to be, and we'll conduct the final checklist as outlined in 18.2, normal procedures. All right, and then the pilot flying at 1,000 feet AGL, pilot flying, so pilot monitoring will state 1,000 feet above the airport, pilot flying checked, props max, bleeds by 400. So we'll set the props to max and bleeds off, and to min. Bleeds will normally be selected off at 400 AGL for passenger comfort, but may be selected off at a higher altitude at PM discretion. Pilot flying, no response required. Approach minimums, so pilot monitoring will say 100 to go, and then we'll say whether the lights are in sight or not. And then everything else is the same with respect to the missed approach, except the LNAV Alt Select. So push nav Alt Select for the autopilot once we climb with the gear, once the gear's up and all that good stuff, and we're climbing at GAV2. That's the only difference there. Non-precision approach is pretty similar. So 1.5 miles prior to the final approach fix, pilot flying will call gear down. We'll do the same flaps 15 final checklist. The only difference here is set the next altitude. So the pilot flying will instruct the pilot monitoring to set the next step down, or MDA, in the altitude controller. And so we'll set that as instructed by the pilot flying. We'll conduct a final checklist as associated. Then the rest is the same as well for the missed approach. So the final checklist that we keep talking about, the duties, with the 300 model, the aux transfer needs to be off. The rest is the final checklist. We're going to verify the gear 3 green in the lights. We'll verify the 150 knots, all that good stuff. The landing gear unsafe advisory lights will illuminate while the gear is in transit and extinguish after the gear extension is complete. So we'll check the hydraulic system indicators for normal system pressure and turn the synchro phase off. So that's important to do on landing. So your final checklist is, kind of gumps, but the S is now the synchro phase. Flaps, just verify the flaps. Will verify 140 knots and select flaps 15 or 35 as briefed. 15 for headwinds and tailwind components 0 to 10 knots. 35 for tailwinds greater than 10 knots, essentially. We'll verify the flap deployment as well. Ensure the flap selector lever is set in the appropriate detent and the trigger is not in the raised position. Synchro phase is off after lowering the landing gear, and manually synchronize the props accordingly. Props will be at max, bleeds will be at min and off. At 400 AGL. The pilot monitoring will then respond, final checklist complete. So the props max will be advance the levers to max at a minimum of 1,000 feet AGL. So we'll do that above 1,000